My own daughter stole from this family. The sentence landed in the middle of Christmas Eve dinner like a glass dropped on tile. Not shattering. Just wrong. Loud in the wrong way. 31 relatives went quiet at once. Forks paused midair. My cousin Mark stopped whatever story he had been telling. My Aunt Karen set down her wine glass with a soft click that somehow carried across the entire table. My father, Richard Caldwell, was standing at the head of the long dining table in my aunt's house outside Seattle. He was holding an envelope. Ivory paper, slightly thick, the kind that comes from a lawyer's office or a bank. He held it with 2 fingers, carefully, the way you hold something you want other people to notice you holding. Across from me, my mother Linda had already raised a napkin to her face, though there was nothing yet to wipe. My father slid the envelope across the polished wood. It stopped in front of my plate. "This," he said, with the measured calm of a man who had spent 30 years in courtrooms, "contains documentation showing that Emily made unauthorized withdrawals from your grandfather's estate account." Every pair of eyes at the table turned toward me. Some with shock. Some with the particular discomfort of people who aren't sure where to look. A few, just a few, with an expression that told me they had already been briefed. I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at my father. I didn't open it yet. Because here's what my father didn't know, what I had spent the last 4 months making sure he wouldn't know until the right moment. I had been building my own case. And it was significantly more complete than his. Let me back up. 3 months before that dinner, my grandfather Harold passed away at 81, after a fall in his kitchen the previous summer had started a slow decline. He left behind a modest estate, a house, some investments, and a family trust that had been accumulating quietly for decades. The kind of estate that isn't glamorous but matters to the people it belongs to. After he passed, the estate went through a standard pre-distribution audit. That's when the auditor flagged something, nearly $220,000 missing from a secondary holding account connected to the trust. No one accused me directly. At first. Not out loud. But I had been the family member managing Harold's paperwork since his fall, paying his bills, organizing his records, logging into his financial accounts every week. When money goes missing from an account you had access to, you don't need someone to say your name. You just start to notice who isn't making eye contact at family dinners. I noticed. And I started asking my own questions. The first unusual transfer I found was in May, 2 months before any of the withdrawals my father would later pin on me. It was small. $15,000. Routed through an account I didn't recognize, at 11:40 at night. I flagged it mentally and kept watching. By late June, I had seen 5 more like it. That was when I stopped treating it as a bookkeeping question and started treating it as something else entirely. So I did something my father never anticipated. I hired a forensic financial investigator. Not a lawyer. Not a family friend with a background in accounting. A professional whose specific job is following money through systems designed to obscure it, someone who has spent years learning how people move funds when they believe no one is paying attention. What he found, over the next 3 months, made everything very clear. The missing money was real. The trail it left was real. And the person who moved it had made one critical mistake: they assumed I wouldn't look. Back at the table, my father was still waiting. "You should open it," he said. The room was very quiet. Even the kids at the far end of the table had stopped talking. I picked up the envelope. Turned it over once. "Okay," I said. I reached down beside my chair and placed a slim black folder on the table, right in the center, where everyone could see it. "But after I read yours," I said calmly, "I'd like everyone to read mine." The envelope opened with a clean tear along the top. Inside were 6 pages, printed on heavy stock, organized with the precision of someone who had done this before. Bank statements. A transaction summary. Authorization logs. Timestamps. And at the bottom of the 4th page, a formal analysis prepared by a financial consulting firm, laid out in 3 sections with a letterhead at the top. My father had Not put this together over a weekend. I read through it carefully while the table waited. Around me I could hear the small sounds of people not quite managing to pretend they weren't watching, a chair shifting, someone clearing their throat, the faint sound of someone whispering to the person next to them and then stopping. The documents told a specific story. Between May and late August, 6 transfers had been made from the estate's secondary holding account. Each one was under $50,000, small enough to stay below the threshold that triggers automatic bank alerts. The total came to $219,400. Beside each transfer was an authorization code, and beside each authorization code was a login ID. Mine. There was also an email printed at the back of the stack, a message, dated July, apparently confirming one of the transfer requests. My name was in the header. The language was formal and oddly precise, in a way that felt slightly unlike how I actually write, but close enough that I understood why someone might not notice. I set the last page down and looked at my father. "Well?" my Uncle David asked. My father answered before I could, which told me he had been rehearsing this part. The documents show that Emily used her estate account access to authorize 6 transfers from the secondary holding account. The total matches the amount identified in the audit as missing. The authorization codes are linked to her login credentials. The financial firm that prepared the analysis has verified the chain of transfers independently. Around the table, people were absorbing this quietly. My cousin Mark rubbed the back of his neck. "That's pretty specific." "Yes," my father said. "It is." My Aunt Karen looked at my mother. Linda was looking at the table, not at me. "We didn't want to believe it," my mother said softly. "That's why we waited. We wanted to be certain before saying anything." I considered that sentence for a moment. Waited. Wanted to be certain. They had hired an outside financial firm. They had printed documents and brought them to Christmas dinner. At some point in that process, they had made a decision, not to call me, not to ask me privately, not to give me the chance to explain before an audience of 30 people. They had decided that certainty meant a folder of documents, not a conversation. That told me something. "These are thorough," I said. My father accepted the observation like a compliment. "Thank you. Can I ask a few questions before we go further?" He gestured slightly. "Of course. When did you first see the audit results?" "About 6 weeks ago." "And when did you hire the financial firm?" "Shortly after." "So you've had roughly 6 weeks to review this." "That's correct." I tapped the top page lightly. "And in those 6 weeks, did you consider calling me?" A pause. "We felt it was important to have the full picture first," he said. "Right." I nodded slowly. "And how long have I been managing Grandpa's financial paperwork?" "Since last September." 11 months. Approximately. And in those 11 months, before May, nothing was missing. My father's expression didn't change. But something behind it did, a small shift, the kind you only notice if you've been watching someone for a long time. "The audit identified irregularities beginning in May," he said carefully. "Prior to that, the accounts were reconciling normally." "Right," I said again. "So whoever made these transfers started doing it 8 months after I got access." "Not immediately. Not when the access was new and harder to trace. 8 months later." "People wait," my father said. "To establish trust first." It was a good answer. He had anticipated that point. But I hadn't finished. "The email at the back," I said, flipping to the last page. "The one confirming the July transfer." "Yes?" "What account did it come from?" He blinked. "Just slightly. It's in the header." I looked at the header. The email address was a Gmail account, the same one I use for personal correspondence, the one I've had for 12 years. "Has anyone verified this email actually exists in my sent folder?" I asked. Silence. "Because I can pull up my Gmail account right now," I said. On my phone. And we can look together. My father didn't answer immediately. Around the table, a few people exchanged glances. The firm verified the transfer chain, he said finally. The email is corroborating context. Corroborating context, I repeated. I stacked the pages neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and set it to the side. Then I pulled the black folder to the center of the table. 4 months ago, I said, I found something in Grandpa's records I didn't recognize. A transfer out of the primary holding account, not the secondary one, the primary, that I hadn't authorized and couldn't explain. My father was very still now. I assumed at first it was a system error. Banks make mistakes. Estates have a lot of moving parts. But then I found another one. And then a pattern. I opened the folder. So I hired someone to figure out where the money actually went. I looked directly at my father. He found it. The folder contained 3 documents. I had arranged them deliberately, lightest first, heaviest last. The first was a full transaction history across all 3 estate accounts, the main trust, the primary holding account, and the secondary distribution account. It was the kind of document you only get if you know exactly what to ask for and who to ask, not something available through the standard banking portal, but reconstructed by my investigator directly from the bank's records after he had been formally retained to examine the estate's financial history. I passed it to my Uncle David, who was closest, and let it move around the table while I talked. The estate has 3 accounts, I said. Everything in my father's report traces back to the secondary account, the one where my login credentials show up. But if you look at the full history, you'll see something that starts 2 months earlier. Small transfers out of the primary holding account. 10,000 here, 15,000 there. Always after 10 o'clock at night. Always on weekdays. My Aunt Karen frowned at the page. To where? A clearing account, I said. One that isn't part of the estate structure. What's a clearing account used for? Mark asked. Routing, I said. It's a temporary stop between where money starts and where it ends up. In estate management, they're used legitimately for things like tax payments or trustee fees. But they're also useful if you want to add a step between the source and the destination, something that makes the trail harder to follow at a glance. My father hadn't reached for the document. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table, watching me explain, his expression carefully neutral. A clearing account doesn't prove anything by itself, he said. Estates use intermediary accounts routinely. You're right, I said. That's why my investigator didn't stop at the clearing account. I passed the second document across to David. It was a transfer map, a visual chart following the money from the primary holding account through the clearing account to a final destination. 3 columns. Every transfer timestamped. Every amount labeled. The total at the bottom of the right column, $219,400. The same number my father had announced at the beginning of dinner. David studied it for a long moment. His finger moved down the right column slowly. Where does it end up? He asked. I reached into the folder and turned over the third document. It was a screenshot of a banking account profile. Name of account holder. Account number partially redacted. Bank logo in the top corner. The name on the account read, Caldwell Consulting LLC. My father's consulting firm. The one he had operated out of Bellevue for the past 15 years. The table was quiet for several seconds. That's your company, Mark said slowly. It wasn't a question. My father's voice was measured and deliberate. My firm processes a significant number of payments and transfers every month. The fact that an amount matching the estate shortfall appears in our account doesn't establish causation. There could be any number of explanations for 6 transfers, I said. Over 3 months. Each one moving through the same clearing account. Each one landing in the same destination. The total matching the audit shortfall to within $100. Richard. My Uncle David's voice had changed. It was quieter now, and more careful, the voice of someone choosing words slowly. Is that your firm's account? My father held David's gaze for a moment. Yes, he said. It is our business account. And the money in Emily's chart ends up there. The chart suggests that. I'm not in a position to verify it without reviewing the underlying data. The underlying data is on that flash drive, I said, and placed it on the table. It was a small thing. Black plastic. Unremarkable. That contains the complete login records for the estate banking portal, I said. Every session that accessed the account, the timestamp, the geographic location, the device ID, and the browser signature. My investigator pulled them directly from the bank. Device ID? Karen asked. Every device that connects to a banking portal leaves a fingerprint, I explained. Operating system, browser version, a hardware identifier. Banks use it for fraud detection. If your account is suddenly being accessed from a device they don't recognize, they flag it. My investigator cross-referenced the device ID used in every session that authorized a transfer out of the estate primary account. I paused. Then he compared it to the login records for Caldwell Consulting's corporate banking portal. The room held its breath. The device that accessed the estate account, I said, is the same device that accesses the Caldwell Consulting account. Same hardware ID. Same operating system. Same browser version. Sometimes logged into both within minutes of each other. My father said nothing. My cousin Mark leaned forward and looked at the transfer map again, then at the account screenshot, then at my father. For the first time since dinner began, Richard Caldwell looked like a man who had prepared for one conversation and found himself in a completely different one. The silence lasted long enough that my Aunt Karen's youngest son, he's 8, asked his mother something in a low voice, and she quietly told him to wait. Then my father spoke. Device IDs can be spoofed, he said. That's a known vulnerability in digital forensics. Without a court-ordered forensic image of the actual hardware, the investigator anticipated that, I said. I opened the folder again and pulled out one final sheet, a comparison table I had asked my investigator to prepare specifically for this kind of challenge. 2 columns. Estate account login records on the left. Caldwell Consulting corporate account logins on the right. Matching device IDs. Matching operating system builds, not just Windows or Mac, but specific version numbers. Matching browser versions down to the decimal. And matching time clusters, sessions that occurred within minutes of each other, on the same days, from the same device. I passed it to Mark, who read it quietly and then passed it to David without speaking. April 14th, Mark said after a moment. These 2 sessions are 3 minutes apart. Yes, I said. David studied the page. The same device logged into the estate account and then into Caldwell Consulting's account 3 minutes later. That's what the records show. My father pushed back from the table, not dramatically, just the slow movement of someone who needs a moment to think. I'm not going to respond in real time to a document I've never seen before tonight, he said. That's not reasonable. You asked me to respond in real time to documents I'd never seen before tonight, I said. A few people around the table shifted uncomfortably, because that was accurate and everyone knew it. My father looked at me for a moment. Then he said, the analysis you've presented is selective. Every investigation is shaped by what the investigator is looking for. Your investigator was looking for evidence pointing away from you, naturally he found it. He was looking for where the money went, I said. That's the assignment. Where did $219,000 go? He followed it. These are the results. And who verified his methodology? I can provide his credentials and firm references if the estate executor wants them. He's been retained in over 40 cases in Washington state. His work has held up in court. My father had no immediate response to that. Around the table, the dynamic had shifted in a way that was visible even without looking directly at any one person. At the beginning of the evening, my father had held the authority in the room, not just because of the documents, but because of the weight of his presence, his decades of professional confidence, the way people who have known someone for 30 years still defer to the version of them they first understood. That authority had been eroding steadily since I placed the black folder on the table, and now it was mostly gone. My Uncle David set the comparison chart down carefully. "Richard," he said. "I need you to explain something to me plainly." My father waited. "The money went into your firm's account. The device that moved it also accesses your firm's account. I've known you for 35 years. David paused. "Tell me there's something here I'm missing." The table waited. My father was quiet for a long moment, not the confident quiet of someone formulating a precise answer, but the heavier quiet of someone who has run the calculations and doesn't like any of the outcomes. Then my mother spoke. Her voice was small. Flat. The voice of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally decided to put it down. "Richard. Tell them about the loan." My father turned to look at her. "Linda, tell them." The room was completely still. "What? Loan?" David asked. My mother looked at the table. At the documents spread across it. At the flash drive sitting quietly in the center. "Richard borrowed money from the estate," she said. "He told me in September that he would replace it before the audit was finalized. He said he had a plan." The table erupted not loudly, not with shouting, but with the overlapping voices of people who have just had something large and unexpected land in front of them and are all trying to process it simultaneously. "You took money from Dad's estate? How much? Richard, is that true?" My father held up one hand. The room quieted, not because he commanded it the way he had at the beginning of the evening, but out of the old habit of listening to him. "It was a bridge," he said. His voice was quieter now. Slower. "The firm had a payment delayed, a significant contract, a dispute clause that froze the funds while the client's legal team reviewed the terms. We had payroll due. A lease renewal. I needed liquidity for 60 days, maybe 90. The estate was sitting liquid, the distribution was months away, and I calculated that I could return the funds before anyone looked closely at the secondary account." "But the audit was moved up," I said. He didn't answer. "The executor brought it forward by 2 months," I continued. "And suddenly the gap was going to be visible before you could fill it." Still no answer. "So you needed the gap to have an explanation." My father closed his eyes for just a moment. Then he opened them and looked at me, directly, for the first time that evening. "I thought if there was another plausible account," he said quietly, "the investigation would stop before it reached the firm." He didn't say my name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood what another plausible account meant. My father's admission didn't produce a dramatic moment. There was no single gasp, no one standing up and pointing. What happened instead was quieter and, in some ways, harder to watch. 30 people recalibrating at once. Revising what they thought they knew. Adjusting the internal story they had been telling themselves since my father first stood up and said what he said. It takes a moment for that kind of revision to complete. My Uncle David was the first to speak once it did. "The executor needs to know about this," he said. His voice was steady and deliberate. "Not next week. Tomorrow morning." "I'll contact the executor myself," my father said. "We'll contact the executor together," David replied. "With the family attorney present. That's how this gets handled." My father didn't argue. He had spent the last 20 minutes losing ground, and he seemed to understand that the ground was gone. My Aunt Karen turned to my mother. "Linda. How long have you known?" My mother folded her napkin carefully before she answered. "He told me in September," she said. "When the first transfers had already happened. He said it was temporary. That it would be resolved quietly and no one would be affected." "Did you know about Emily?" Karen asked. A pause. "Not until 3 weeks ago." "And then?" My mother looked at her hands. I told him it was wrong. Karen let that sit for a moment. Then she nodded once and said nothing else. It wasn't absolution, and I don't think my mother was looking for it. But it was honest, and honest was something the evening had been short on until the last half hour. My cousin Mark came around to my side of the table at some point, I'm not entirely sure when, and sat in the empty chair beside me. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. For what? I heard the rumors in October. I didn't say anything to you. I don't know what I figured. That it would get sorted out. That maybe there was an explanation I didn't understand. There was, I said. You just didn't know what it was yet. I should have asked you directly. Maybe, I said. But you didn't accuse me either. That's something. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when did you actually know it was him? I didn't know for certain until about 6 weeks ago, when the investigator finished the device analysis. Before that I had strong suspicion. The transfer patterns, the routing, the timing, it pointed in a direction. But suspicion isn't the same as evidence. And you waited. I waited, I agreed. I didn't know what he was planning to do with it. I thought maybe he'd return the money before the audit and the whole thing would disappear. It wasn't until I saw the audit results and then got a call from my mother asking if I'd looked into the estate accounts recently that I understood where it was heading. Mark shook his head slowly. What would you have done if tonight hadn't happened? Gone to the executor directly, I said. Before the distribution. I wasn't going to let it go. Across the table, my father was talking quietly with David and one of my older uncles. The conversation looked difficult. Not argumentative, just heavy. The kind of conversation where everyone already knows the shape of what needs to happen, and the work is just getting through it. My father's firm, it turned out, had been struggling for longer than the current payment dispute. A series of smaller contracts had ended or not renewed over the previous 2 years. The Bellevue office lease was expensive. He had been managing it, not well, but managing, until the large contract dispute froze a substantial payment and the math stopped working. He had made a calculation, 60 to 90 days, liquid estate funds, no one would look closely, replaced before distribution. The calculation was wrong in almost every respect. The audit moved up. The funds weren't replaced. And rather than come forward, to the executor, to his brothers, to anyone, he had tried to build a redirect. I don't entirely understand the thinking that leads a person there. I've spent time trying to, and I'm not sure I've gotten all the way. But I think some part of it was that he had spent so long being the person in the room who managed things, who resolved problems, who never needed to ask for help, that asking for help had stopped feeling like an option. So instead he did what he knew how to do, which was build a case. He just built it in the wrong direction. The estate executor was contacted the following morning. A family attorney was retained by the end of the week. My father's firm entered a structured repayment arrangement, with oversight, to return the funds before the final distribution was processed. Whether anything beyond that followed, formally, legally, I was not the one to decide. That belonged to the executor and the family, and I wasn't going to be the person pushing for a particular outcome. Before I left my aunt's house that night, I went back to the dining room to get my coat. Most people had drifted into smaller conversations in other rooms. The table was mostly cleared. The ivory envelope was still sitting at my father's place. I looked at it for a moment. Then I picked it up, folded it once, and put it in the recycling bag by the door. Outside, it was cold and clear. The kind of December night where the air has a quality to it, sharp and still. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving. My grandfather had a saying he used whenever he caught a mistake in the household finances, a wrong total, a missed payment, a column that didn't add up. He'd tap the page with one finger and say, "Numbers don't lie. People lie. Numbers just repeat what people did." He was right. The numbers hadn't lied. They had just been waiting for someone to read them all the way through. If you stayed with this story to the end, thank you. These kinds of situations happen more often than people talk about. Family, money, and trust have a way of getting complicated in ways no one fully anticipates until they're standing in the middle of it. If any part of this resonated with you, or if you've been in a situation where you had to build a quiet case while waiting for the right moment, we'd genuinely like to hear your perspective in the comments. New stories publish every week. If you'd like to follow along, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.